Today, we're going to be turning this glass box into a beautiful terrarium. Let's get started. We're going to be starting off with this empty glass box, which is made using picture frame and silicone. It's one of my first experiments cutting glass and making a tank, so some of the edges are a little bit wavy and uneven. Now we're using this piece of cardboard that we cut to the same size as the tank beforehand. We're going to place it on the bottom of the tank, and this will protect the glass from any pressure points that might build up from resting on any uneven surfaces or even things like little grains of sand. We're fixing it to the underside of the tank with tape, but you can use double-sided tape or really anything. Now we're going to start working the false bottom. We want a level surface about an inch tall. This will allow excess water to flow out of the soil instead of stagnating and causing algae or root rot or anything like that. For this job, I'm using Leica, but that's only because I already have it on hand. I haven't really noticed it does anything better than regular gravel, other than it's a little bit more lightweight. For this tank, we want a fairly high drainage layer because it's going to have a high moisture content. But for most tanks, you don't even really need anything more than 3/4 of an inch, and smaller tanks sometimes don't even need any. Now we're just going to smooth it out until it's nice and level. As we turn the tank to the side, you can see that there aren't any high or low points here either. Now we're going to cut a little bit of window screen mesh to stop any of the dirt from falling down into the drainage layer. This is known as a substrate barrier, and it is not required, but it is very useful. And if you live in a house, you probably have some window screen mesh laying around anyway. Next, we're going to be taking a good-sized chunk of window screen mesh and stretching it out. Then we're going to set the tank back on top of it and use any blade to cut it to size, tracing around the perimeter of the tank. Chances are, most of your cuts aren't going to be perfect, so you can remove any of the larger imperfections with a pair of scissors or a knife, and you can remove any of the small ones just by ripping them apart with your hands. Pretty soon, we're left with just a square piece of window screen mesh that's about the same size as the tank. Ideally, you want it to be a little bit bigger than the tank, so it can fit snugly against the walls. Now we're going to place it inside the tank and make sure that there are no gaps in between the walls and the mesh. In this case, it just so happened that I had cut it a little bit too big, but I chose to ignore it. Next, I wanted to build up a little bit more height in the back without using a whole bunch of soil. So I decided that using this gravel from Home Depot was a good way to do it. I'm just pouring a bunch of it back there, and I'm going to smooth it out in just a second. To smooth it out, I'm using this, I think someone called it a sand spatula online, I don't even remember. But you don't even need one of these, you can just use your hands. And after all that prep, it's finally time for substrate. Substrate is just another word for dirt. I like to use about half compost and a little bit of sphagnum moss and other used potting soil from all of my plants that I just mix in because it's free dirt. We're putting in a good sized layer in here so that way all the rooted plants can have nutrients. But to be fair, most of the rooted plants won't even be planted down here anyway, so it's just for aesthetic. Next, we're going to take some aqua soil and sprinkle it on top. Aqua soil is cool because it's designed to be able to sit in water without having it get all nasty. So we're using that in this very humid environment. After sprinkling it all over the top, I'm going to come back in with my hand and remove any of the larger clumps and just brush it all over the top. Now we get to move on to the unique part of this build, the hardscape. We're using this extra plant pot that I had from one of my plants, and we chose this one because it's rather thin and it's flexible and easy to cut with a knife. I had already cut some holes in this pot in the hopes that they would work as drainage or just stuff to poke more hardscape into. I ended up not using them in the build, so we're going to cover those back up with some window screen mesh. In order to do that, we're going to use a whole bunch of hot glue and just draw a circle around the opening where you want the window screen mesh to go, and place the window screen mesh back on top. We repeat that for the upside, and their repair job is done. Time to move on to the exterior. The screen isn't the most natural color ever, and I think we can do a lot better with the texture. So in order to do this, we're going to be taking some dirt and placing on the exterior. Probably it would be better to go with cork bark here, but I don't have any of that, so we're just going to use hot glue to fix the dirt onto the side. We're just adding a good few dollars of hot glue over a good area, smoothing it out and pressing some dirt into it. After, we're just going to tap off the rest of the dirt, and look at that. We continue this process for almost the entire rest of the container, just coming back and filling in any of the gaps. I also added this extra fibrous plant bit that I had laying around, and I think it adds a little bit more texture. I'm not sure what it is though. I'm not really liking the way this lip at the top of the plant pot is looking, so I'm just going to cut that right off, and try to make sure it doesn't look too straight and unnatural. And here you can see we've got a little bit of the hot glue poking through the dirt. I kind of like the way it looks. I think it looks like roots, but if you want to cover that up, you totally can. I tried using hot glue to bond the side of the container with the plastic plant pot, but it didn't work because hot glue doesn't adhere well to glass, and the container is made of glass. I could have used silicone here, because that definitely sticks well to glass. That's what they build aquariums out of. But I didn't want to do that because I don't want a permanent bond between the side of the container and the plant pot, so I can reuse the container. I had a second slice of plant pot that I made off camera, just so that way it's a little bit more balanced. After adjusting the camera for a little bit, it's finally time to move on to the rest of the hardscape. We're going to start by using some red lava rock. I played around with different positions a little bit before finally finding one that I liked and tapping it down. After I placed in each of the large pieces, I decided I wanted to have a little bit more coverage on the top of that plant pot. So I put on some hot glue, and then I added another bit of that fibrous plant. After I was finished with that, I went back and added a couple of smaller pieces from a lava rock I crushed with a hammer. Eventually I decided I wanted a little bit more sloping up in the back area, so I just added another handful of dirt. Soon it was time to finish filling up the plant pots. I decided to start with a good sized layer of gravel, and then top it off with a little bit more dirt. It was about here that I realized the hot glue marks from earlier were really ugly, so I wanted to try and at least fill in some of the gaps that sphagged them. In order to do that, I just took a couple of the larger pieces and pressed them up against the inside of the crack. Now we get to top off the plant pots with the dirt. Here we're just using the same mix as before, except eliminating the nasty scattering step. Once you're done with that, we get to add most of our wood for the hardscape, and today I'm going to be using rosemary branches. Why? Because this is a terrarium, there aren't any animals that oils can poison, and because I have an almost infinite supply of them growing in the yard. About now, I realized I needed a background, and I had these two boards lying around, so I just put them together before I could find any black paper to cut out. After taking care of that, I added a couple of other small details, like this branch here to cover up the glue marks, and this last lava rock up at the top. In case you hadn't noticed, the scape I'm trying to go for here is almost two cliffs on either side, with a net of branches making up a roof over the top, almost sort of like a cave. I had the sand ready at this point, but I decided I didn't want to use it until later in the video, so we'll just set that aside for now. And out comes the moss tub. In here we've got a mixture of broom fork moss and Menzies tree moss. This broom fork moss is a lot lower growing than the tree moss, so we're going to be using that for the foreground. Broom fork moss has an unfortunate tendency to come with a bunch of old dead growth on the bottom, so we'll just trim that off using a pair of scissors. You can discard the bits that you chop off, but I like to recycle them back into my substrate mix because it's free dirt. Now I'm just picking up and discarding any of the dying or unsightly bits of moss that I don't want to put in the terrarium. Now we're going to place the moss in the terrarium where we want it and pat it down so it forms a nice, dense, compact, and low-growing carpet. Now we're taking another piece of the same type of moss. We're preparing it and replacing it in the terrarium on the opposite side to start work on the carpet there. Ideally, you would use another large piece of this moss, but I don't have any on hand, so a couple of small pieces will work just fine. After I discarded all the scraps, I realized that I was completely out of broom fork moss. Except I had some growing in another terrarium. Oh well, desperate times call for desperate measures. This is a good example of what broom fork moss does in a terrarium if you don't trim it. It'll get really tall, and this is probably what's going to happen to the stuff we already have in our terrarium we're building. So now we come in with our pair of long scissors, and we're just going to cut away a chunk of this beautiful moss mat. I then used a pair of pliers to take out chunks of the moss mat, but you could use your fingers or even the pair of scissors again. Now that we have a few chunks of this moss, we get to go back to our terrarium and start placing it in. We're putting it in the gaps around the rocks, so that way it's got a nice flush look to it. Now for our midground and background moss. For this we're going to be using Menzies tree moss, which is a kind of moss native to where I live. It usually grows fairly low and compact, but in a terrarium environment it'll get really tall, which helps make it a nice background moss. So we're going to be placing it in the terrarium. But not before we trim it down. We're going to take our pair of scissors and cut off all of the extra tall bits. We're going to collect them for later because we can use it to create more moss. Once again, we're going to be taking this moss and sticking it in the background wherever we want any taller growth than the broom moss would otherwise let us. We can also take pieces of it and stick it in any of the gaps and cracks in between your rocks to make it look forward. I wanted to create a path down the middle, but right now I'm not too happy with how this foreground part is looking. It's a little bit too lopsided, so we're going to fix that. In order to do that, we're just cutting off the front corner of this patch of moss and moving it to the other side. I originally had a little bit of the Menzies tree moss on this side, but I knew that eventually it would grow too tall and look horrible, so I just got rid of it and replaced it with this moss. It's finally time to start planting the large plants. We're going to start off with this black rabbit's foot fern. I don't want to use this whole plant, so we're going to break it up into smaller pieces. We do that by gripping both sides of the root we want to break, and then phone runs out of storage. Luckily, I noticed that pretty quickly, so we can resume. As I was saying, we just break apart the fern and take each little plant and stick it in each of the back corners. Now we're going to add some jade plants in the back. Jade plants are succulents, so usually you would think that they don't like a lot of water, but this kind seems to get along well with it. Next up is Photonia albavensis variant Red Ann. A couple of these leaves are getting really good color to them, so I'm going to save these ones and see how well they grow out. Now we're taking cuttings from some of the less colorful ones. These will root in no time and start growing to their very own plants. After I planted those in, I decided that the top was still looking too barren, so I went ahead and covered it up with some Menzies tree moss. Over the course of the build, I keep deciding that the top needs more and more moss, so if you see me doing that, that's what it is. Now we get to add the sand. At first I was a little bit worried about how we were going to get it down underneath all the branches without messing up the hardscape, but I just realized you could sprinkle it right over the top and no one would ever be the wiser. That's looking pretty good. Now it's time to completely finish the hardscape by adding a couple of sticks. We're putting these down and branching out over some of the rocks and just in general, hoping that they would look like almost like tree roots. After I added this stick, I later decided I didn't really like it very much because it was too close to the glass and the reflection looked horrible. I would fix this later, but it's gonna stay there for now. Well, here we go again. After adding 2 sticks, I once again got distracted and decided I wanted to add another plant. This one is a Sattendorf pothos. I have been soaking the cutting in water, and it's almost completely rooted at this point, but it's not all the way there yet. I'm hoping that it'll finish taking root and we will be able to train it across these sticks. I added a few more details to the hardscape before I decided to move on to one of the final plants, Peperomia rana verde. I placed one of each of these plants in the back corners, like most of the plants in this build. After giving the whole thing a good spray down and adding a couple of Anubias non-appetit, we're done.